Welcome to a Celtic State of Mind. I'm John Dykes, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Phil Scraton. I was made aware of Phil's work when I read his book, Hillsborough, The Truth, and thereafter seen him being interviewed on the documentary that screened nationwide. Phil, welcome to a Celtic State of Mind.
Thank you so much, Paul, for having me on.
It's a real pleasure, and I've always had this image in my mind of a friendship between Liverpool and Celtic, and also a real similarity between the two cities. So it's a real pleasure to have you here. Phil, tell us first and foremost about your upbringing in the city of Liverpool and your memories of going to Anfield.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was brought up across the water for the early part of my life in a place called Wallasey, which is very close to Liverpool. My mother was a Birkenhead Catholic, and my father was a Liverpool Protestant, and they got together at a time when I suppose the sectarianism that we see in all of our cities was quite severe on Merseyside. And so I was brought up a Catholic originally, and I now no longer have a religion, but I went to school locally. It was a relatively poor family because my dad was ill from when I was very young. We were a happy family, having said that, and I was a bit of a holy Joe. You know, I served Mass and all of that, and went to a Catholic primary school, and ended up, when I was 12 years old, not a lot of people know this, I ended up going into a seminary, where I was until I was in my mid to late teens. But growing up, it was pretty clear that most young kids either supported Everton, because they were in what was called the First Division then, or they supported one of the other teams. They didn't really support them, they just fancied them, so it would be Wolves or Spurs or clubs like that. I had nobody that I knew as a child supported Manchester United, that's for sure, but they would just choose a team. And I was the only child in my class to support Liverpool because Liverpool were in the second division. My dad was a Liverpool fan, and I went to my first match when I was 4 years old. I don't remember an awful lot of it. Maybe I was 5, but I remember sitting on my dad's knee in the stand, which was very rare for me ever to be in the stands. But I was sitting on my dad's knee watching the match, and I'll never forget it because, and maybe some of this is retrospect, but they won 4-3 against Grimsby Town, and somebody who will be well known to your older listeners, Billy Little, the great Scottish player, scored a hat-trick, including a penalty, and one shot that went in off the bar that I'm sure must have broken the bar. And he was my child hero. You know, Billy Little was the guy who I grew up just thinking was, you know, fantastic. He was the Kenny Dalglish of my kids' generation, you know, and just absolutely fantastic. And little did I know then that I would end up going to Liverpool University many years down the line. And there, who was one of the main accountants in Liverpool University, by that time, a little-known Billy Little. And I never forget the day that I made a spurious kind of reason to go to his office saying I needed some claim forms when I didn't, just so that I could meet him and go, oh man, you're Billy Little, I just loved you when I was a kid. And I'm sure there were loads of people who felt like that. One of Scotland's great players and one of Liverpool's all-time greats, and actually playing in boots that were like, you know, really big toe caps and on muddy pitches, but by goodness could he hit the ball. So no, that was the early days, and loving football, playing out in the street all the time, ever had an opportunity to play. My dad maybe hang a ball on a rope from a lamppost, and I was only allowed to kick it with my left foot when it came back because he was determined that I was going to be a two-footed player. Mm-hmm. And that was and I did. I went on and I played what we used to be called left half in the old days, left midfield, and that was the background to it. So I had little choice. I was a red born and bred, as we say.
The thing with that, Phil, obviously you, like many, take that influence from your father, very much like myself and many other listeners. But I mean, by the 70s, you must have been thanking him for all the glories, and you mentioned Dalglish already coming down and winning 3 European Cups. So what kind of memories stick out for you as a Liverpool fan? I know that you're in good shape just now, of course.
Well, yeah, we are too. People will do anything to stop Liverpool from winning the league, won't they? So, no, what it was, I guess. When I went into the seminary, of course, I couldn't go to the match because I was away for 40-odd weeks in the year. But I've never forgotten that very special day when we won the Cup for the first time in the history. And that was the 1st of May Day, 1965. And I was travelling back to the seminary in a coach. We were in the seminary up in Durham, lived in Liverpool by this point. And I was going up to the seminary in the coach, and we stopped off at a place called Kirby Stephen. And they had this little old black and white telly in there. And we watched the extra time. And, of course, another great Scot, Ian St. John, scored the winner to beat Leeds United 2-1, and it was just remarkable. And that was my first real memory of a trophy. And, of course, it was the first time Liverpool had ever won the Cup. Mm-hmm. This put us into the Cup Winners' Cup. Little did I know at that moment that early the following year, 1966, I decided that the priesthood wasn't for me. And I'd fancied the college tailor's daughter, I think, and that was the beginning of the end. That was downhill slope after that. So I came out of the seminary in 66, in time actually for the World Cup, and I saw 3 of the games, including the very famous Pelé game and the Eusebio games, the Korea 5-3 that after Portugal had been down 3-0 to Korea in the first half. But I remember that coming out of the seminary and going straight to Anfield. And, of course, Liverpool were now in the European Cup Winners' Cup. And we were at Anfield in the build-up to that, and we were playing, of course, Celtic. And we needed to win that game. And I was on the Kop, and I was not a very tall 15-year-old. And I remember spending much of the match with my feet off the ground just as the crowd swayed backwards and forwards. And it was a remarkable game because Liverpool had to come back and win. And they did. They won with very little time left in the game. I think it was Jeff Strong scored a header down our end at the Kop. And quite a few of the Celtic fans down in the Anfield Road end went off on one and started chucking bottles onto the pitch. And Tommy Lawrence, who was a Scot himself and who was in goal, kind of walked out of his penalty area and was pointing out. In fact, it was very sad that a young lad got hit with a bottle and ended up in a coma. Mm-hmm. The point of me bringing that up isn't in any way to criticise Celtic as such, but to tell a more important story that came out of that. We got to the final. The final was in Glasgow, and we were there to play Borussia Dortmund, who coincidentally are now the team of my daughter-in-law, who herself is from Germany. And that's just by the by, a little bit of personal information there. And my mum said, "You're not going." She just said, "It's too dangerous after what had happened at Anfield. There'll be all sorts going on. I said, oh, Mum, I've got to go. This is going to be the only chance I'm going to have to go to a European Cup final. And I laid it on thick. And in the end, she agreed. And she made me a scarf, which I still have to this day, a red scarf, all red. And it is 15 foot long, massive. It goes round my neck 3 times and still touches the floor on both sides. So we went, and she made me this wonderful rosette that went on the front of the coach. I mean, it was a really big rosette, and it went on the front of the coach. And it was a beautiful day as we set off. And the point of telling this story is that when we got to Glasgow, the Glaswegians were just absolutely fantastic. The Celtic supporters were brilliant. They welcomed us with open arms. They took us to the social clubs. They looked after us because of what had happened previously in Liverpool. And they were just really, really fantastic. It was a wonderful reception. And that was the beginning. I believe that Wednesday, the 5th of May, which coincidentally is Karl Marx's birthday, Wednesday, not that that's going to do with anything, but that Wednesday, the 5th of May, 1966, I believe, was the day when the special relationship between Celtic and Liverpool was forged. And it wasn't forged by the clubs. It was forged by the fans. It didn't matter, well, it did matter at the time, that we lost 2-1 in extra time. And it was absolutely pouring down at Hampden Park. And in those days, there was no shelter. We were out in the rain. Yeah. I came back in the in summer. We didn't take big clothes with us. So I came back wet through. And I remember traipsing through the streets to get back to our house when we got back to Liverpool, 5 o'clock in the morning, miserable because we'd lost. My rosette was in tatters, and I walked back through the streets, and it was dry by this point, and I was drying out, my clothes were drying out, and as I was walking along, I just thought of the comradeship, the friendship that those Celtic fans had shown us that night. Mm-hmm. And so it was bigger than football. It was more important than football. And I've always believed that ever since then. So by the time Hillsborough happens, of course, I'm thinking in that way, that football, when Shankly said that football is not a matter of life or death, it's more important than that. Bill Shankly didn't mean that literally. But, what he was saying was that it matters so much to many of us. But, nothing mattered more than that solidarity at that time between the two clubs, and that's where it was forged.
Yeah, I find that an incredible story, Phil, because I've always had this in my mind that Liverpool and Celtic have got a great relationship. You put it down to similar cities, similar industries perhaps in the past, the Irish diaspora, the friendships between Shankly and Steen, but as you say, that there's a bond between two sets of fans there, and it's really interesting for me as a Celtic fan to hear that firsthand, that experience that you had, seeing that burgeoning friendship, if you like, that we'll come back into our discussion a wee bit later on, because I know that the memorial match after Hillsborough is something that, it was so poignant at that time. So to start off our discussion with your memories is incredible, and fair play to you as a 15-year-old jumping on a bus and coming away up to Glasgow for a European final. I mean, you must have been a bit bold, at that age.
Yeah, especially as I'd been in a seminary, and you come out of a seminary, you're scared stiff to look girls in the eye because you've been completely out of that environment, since you're 11, and you don't have the, I suppose you don't have the wherewithal, you don't have the street, you're not wise, but I think probably it was just a boldness in me that I can do it, I'll do it, and probably if I knew what I knew later then, I probably wouldn't have done it at the time. And it was great, and the other thing is that on the coach on the way up, we all went up in what we call charabangs or coaches. We all went up in coaches, and there was a solidarity, mainly men, but a lot of women on the coach. And they look after you, they look out for you when you're that age. And as I've done now with younger ones, when I go to the match, it's always that kind of spirit that's there, and it's what underlines football. And I think in the cities, our cities, football is intricately connected to working class politics. People talk about religion as being the main driver, but if you look at what we have in common across the clubs in both cities, what we have in common is working class roots.
Yeah.
People working on the docks together, people going to sea together. Yeah, of course there have been terrible divisions, and there still are, but that's not the point. The real point is that we all come from the same kind of background. We all understand what it's like to not have very much, and we also understand what it's like to go to a match and be lifted. Even if the match is not particularly brilliant, you're lifted by the atmosphere, you're lifted by other people around you. And that's why in more recent years, when we saw the whole issue of racism, and we'll come to that a bit later, coming into the game on terraces, when we saw the hate that was chanted by Liverpool fans at United fans, but United fans particularly at Liverpool fans after Hillsborough, and then Liverpool fans chanting back Munich. That's one of the reasons I wrote on the blog Munich 1958, a major blog on the Manchester United websites, because I wanted to put it right and say, hang on a minute, you had your disaster, we had ours, and we all share that, and we can't forget that. And I would go all the way back to Rangers and Ibrox, and the disaster there. When you've shared that, that's when death is more significant than life, if you like, because it's something that you understand came out of very bad decisions being made by people who were, to a large extent, ripping off the fans. The places weren't safe. The aircraft that the United team was flying in wasn't safe. All of those issues came to pass as a consequence of tragedy. And that unites us. It would be terrible to actually think about others in the sense of not understanding their grief.
Yeah.
Why would you ever want to feel that? Because we all know that could have been me. That could have been my sister, my mother, my father, my kids. So, I think it's really important to see that when we talk about being united by football, we're also united by what happens around football and the way we were historically treated like cattle.
Absolutely. I mean, when you're talking about the shared state of mind, I guess, or the shared ethos of certain teams, Phil, that really strikes a chord with myself. But you've mentioned something there, being treated like cattle. I mean, that's something that will come back when we're discussing the tragedy at Hillsborough. And a big massive part of that was that, for years and years, these stadiums were underfunded. Fans were treated like cattle, like second-class citizens. And there was a real situation where there was a prejudice almost around football fans at that time. Once we go into the 80s.
Terribly.
Yeah. Do you think that was something that was an issue in terms of when you look at the media coverage, the decisions made on the day, and also obviously Margaret Thatcher's government also as part of that, in terms of the prejudice that had been formed prior to that game, led to some of the decisions that were initially made, but then obviously it was then a cover-up after that. So, I mean, let's have a look at the landscape of football in the 80s. Football fans were basically being treated like hooligans, weren't they?
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I do in the book Hillsborough the Truth, and I did it in the very much so in the Hillsborough Independent Panels Report. I was the primary author of the Hillsborough Independent Panels Report, and determined with my research team to unpack all that happened in the 70s and 80s to create this hostile environment that, as you rightly say, the Thatcher government jumped on and used to its own ends. I mean, the thing was, yes, of course, there was soccer-related violence. I hate the phrase hooliganism. There is violence related to soccer matches. Of course there was. And some of that violence was punch-ups outside stadiums. But the organised violence that captured everybody's imagination, that people talked about, the intercity firm and all of that, and it led to the setting up of the Norman Chester Centre at University of Leicester to look into football hooliganism. That became an industry. And from my point of view, what was happening there was that, yes, there were fans who were in organised groups, often middle-class fans, I might say, in jobs, who organised, the Chelsea Intercity firm, those sort of groups. And, of course, there would be hostilities between Rangers and Celtic. Incidentally, very little hostility between Liverpool and Everton, but there would be hostilities outside grounds. But one of the things I did when I was doing the very initial Hillsborough report, the one that we wrote in 1991, not very long after the disaster, was I was determined to look at just what the statistics were and the numbers were of arrests and the numbers of actual prosecutions, and they were minimal. Yeah. Compared to many European countries, they were minimal. I don't want to say that there was no soccer-related violence. Of course there was, but quite a bit of that was organised. The non-organised violence, the spontaneous violence, yes, it occurred, of course it did. But the idea that there was this decade of appalling behaviour when it was unsafe to go to football matches, it was fed by politicians to their own ends. We all know that the Thatcher government was determined to get this football spectators bill through, which was it would have been a basic infringement on civil liberties, not just around football, but around a lot of other events as well. We all know that reactionary response was part of a political agenda. And the media fed off it. The media loved it. I mean, we don't have a critical media. We know that even more so today. We don't have a critical media. We don't have a media that actually unpacks these stories and really tries to get inside them. And in fact, what it did was it fed into a whole climate of hostility that wasn't just around football. If we think back to it, if we just think back to that period, it was attack on football fans. It was attack on the unions, trades unions, which led eventually to the confrontation over the coal dispute or the miners' strike. It was an attack on civil liberties, particularly the issues around the north of Ireland. It was an attack on poverty. It was this idea that there was an underclass that was growing within our cities that was going to threaten all of our basic values. And what was the phrase that was used? The phrase that was used by that government at that time was a return to Victorian values. And you go, what, a return to Victorian values? No schools, kids working down the pits. Yeah. What Victorian values are you talking about? Yeah. No vote. And so, all of that to me was a real reaction against what was the growth of an early form of socialism that was actually trying to say we need to put power back into the communities. We need to actually develop our cities and our towns in a way where we have control of them. And of course, central government knew that. Their lackeys in the media knew that. So to look at football-related violence in isolation makes it appear that it had nothing to do with the broader politics of the time. And it did. It was front and centre to the broader politics of the time. And it was another vehicle, another stick to beat communities with.
Going back to the attitude, if you like, of Margaret Thatcher's government at that time, her Chancellor then, Sir Geoffrey Howe, stated that Liverpool should be left to a managed decline. So they were quite happy that the industry, the industrial landscape of Liverpool was being diminished, and they were allowing that to happen, almost managing it along. So that backdrop of 1980s Thatcherism is a huge part of what thereafter happened, Phil. And the 15th of April 1989, we're almost 31 years later, and it is as relevant today as it was on the day that it happened because of the aftermath and the ongoing case. And I think you have once said yourself that there can never be closure. There can never be closure. So if we go back, you're a massive Liverpool fan, you've already explained that from a young age. If we go back to 1989, it's actually a game you weren't at. Is it something you ordinarily would have attended?
Yeah, I'll come to that just in a second. We're just picking up on a really important point you were making there about Thatcherism. I mean, you know, what we have to remember about the lead up to Hillsborough is that in 1984 to 84, well, first of all, even before that, 1980-81, we had the uprisings in the cities within the black communities, Liverpool-born black community. We had police officers from most forces in Liverpool. This was the stage upon which Howe made that comment. It was the managed decline was about basically cut Liverpool off, push it out into the Irish Sea and let it sink. That was the kind of notion, really, in the back of their minds. And what was happening in Liverpool at that time was a Liverpool-born black community which had actually suffered institutional racism going back over the century, rose up, as it did in other cities. And as it rose up in that situation, the way in which that kind of insurrection was put down was brutal. Mm-hmm. So this is the early days of Thatcherism. At the same time, she's off to the Malvinas for what she called the Falklands War. At the same time, we've got 10 men on hunger strike in Northern Irish prisons, dying because they want to have political status given to them while they're in prison. And her phrase on that was a crime is a crime is a crime, and basically let them die. Mm-hmm. So they're criminal. We're not going to give them political status, let them die. So this is the backdrop. Then we have the coal dispute, the miners' strike. And where is the heart of the coal dispute? Where is the real centre? South Yorkshire. Which is the police force that actually has the primary responsibility at this time for policing places like Orgreave, Armthorpe, these places that are now cemented into working class trade union history, where real brutality against miners took place. The police force was the South Yorkshire Police. Mm-hmm. That finished in 1985. It was only 4 years later when Hillsborough happened. And Hillsborough nearly happened the previous year in 1988 when Liverpool were there playing against Notts Forest, same semi-final, and it had nearly happened then, only 4 years after the coal dispute. And this was the South Yorkshire Police who policed Hillsborough in the same way as they policed the picket line. And when I came to work on Hillsborough, because I'd written the book, The State of the Police, in 1985, and I'd had a whole chapter on the South Yorkshire Police and the policing of the coal dispute, I was seeing the same names coming up in the aftermath of Hillsborough that I'd seen when I'd been researching the coal dispute. So the tie-in for me was not just one of making it after the fact. The tie-in was there in black and white on the pages, the same police officers, the same organisation. Mm-hmm. So when Hillsborough happened in Sheffield, it was, goodness me, a match that I would have been at. I'd only missed 2 semi-finals because I had very young kids, 1988 and 1989. The 2 Hillsborough semi-finals I missed. I'd been to all the previous semi-finals going back over the years, and I missed both those. And when Hillsborough happened, I was actually upstairs in the house, and I was writing a book on, believe it or not, on Scottish prisons. Right. Called Prisons Under Protest. It was about Peterhead. And Paul came running up the stairs. Dad, come down quickly, Liverpool are on the telly. And I said, they can't be on the telly. It's Saturday afternoon. There's no matches. He said, Dad, Queen, you've got to come quick. And I went running down the stairs thinking, it's snooker that's on grandstand. And when I got downstairs, there was the disaster unfolding on television. Mm-hmm. And I knew then at that moment, I would have been right in the middle of that pen. There's no question. That's where I would have been. And that night, I went into Liverpool, and I met one of my friends who'd been working actually on the Scottish Prisons book. And she and I met in the Crown pub, a pub called the Crown, and fans were coming back. And as they came in through the door, they were distraught, obviously. They were just in a terrible state. And I never forgot, there was a black and white television up above the bar, and John Smith, who was the chair of Liverpool at the time, chairman, he was being interviewed. And he said, this is terrible, this is awful. another disaster because he was talking about Heysel. Liverpool at this point were banned from European grounds because of Heysel. And he said, this is terrible, this is awful. Now what are the chances of us getting back into Europe? I thought the television was going to go out through the window because at that moment, all he was thinking about was his club and his investments. I was furious.
Absolutely.
I was really furious. And that was the moment when I realised we've got to do something about this. And myself and the kids went and stood in the Mile of Scarves, linking Liverpool to Everton, where we all stood holding a scarf and then passing it on to the next person, this long line of scarves. And then we went into the ground and laid them on the pitch and paid our respects to the numbers who died at that point, which weren't 96 at that moment, but they were nearly 96. And when I came away, I'd done a lot of work on deaths in custody, deaths in prisons, deaths in contested circumstances. I was a founder member of the organisation Inquest, and which is now a national organisation, and I founded that with families. And I just knew from the very outset that there was going to be another story, an official version of Hillsborough, and I vowed that wasn't going to happen. And believe it or not, a couple of months later, I was up at Morton Hall Caravan Park just outside Edinburgh with my students. We were doing visits in Scottish prisons. And in those days, you had to put money in boxes. I think it was 5p's and 2p's and stuff. And I got a big stack of these coins. And I went down to because we didn't have mobiles or anything like that. I went down to the little telephone box on the caravan park, and I rang Liverpool City Council. And I got through to the head of the City Council's secretary, and I just poured it all out and said, we've got to do something different. We've got to have an alternative discourse to this. And as soon as I got back and I went and I met him, and they funded the Hillsborough project, which was based in my university at the time. Mm-hmm. And I had 3 research workers, and we wrote the first Hillsborough panel report, the first Hillsborough report, not the panel report, the first Hillsborough report in 1990 and the second in 1995. And they told totally different stories to Taylor. They told a totally different story to the inquest. Of course, by this time, the inquest had been held. They were then the longest inquest in legal history. And the verdict was accidental death. Accidental death. And I couldn't live with this. No. So the second report came out the same in 1995. Massive report, took the inquest apart. Jimmy McGovern, as a consequence of that, Jimmy McGovern made his film Hillsborough. Yeah. And then I thought something's going to happen now, and nothing happened. And that's when I decided to write Hillsborough the Truth. And the first edition was 1999. And that's when I thought, this is it. Taking the lid off it all, you know, I got access to a whole load of information, a whole load of documents, and I put the responsibility where it was. The publishers were going up the wall. They were based in Edinburgh, actually, mainstream.
Yeah, that's right.
They were going up the wall. They were just going mad, saying, how are you going to stand over all of this? You know, you're going to have us all in court. And I said, well, let's just see. And apart from the Chief Constable of Merseyside, who'd been previously a South Yorkshire police officer ringing me at home on an ex-directory number and threatening me, right. Apart from that, there wasn't a word spoken. And I thought, this is it. 1999, 10 years on, we're now going to get the whole story out. It's there in the book. It's all going to come out. And nothing happened. For 10 more years, nothing happened until we got to the panel being set up 10 years later.
See, going back to that phone call that you made, you've contacted the Liverpool City Council, and basically what you're saying to them is this needs to be independent, because you, in your mind, you know that there's going to be a narrative created and there's going to be a result that will obviously allow the people who have been at fault to get away with it. I mean, I can't think of any better words to use, Phil, to get away with the decisions that they had made at that time, which caused the deaths of 96 Liverpool fans. You're ahead of the curve there, but what specifically was it that made you believe that there was going to be this monumental cover-up? Was there things that you were seeing through the media, perhaps, Phil, that made you believe that there was already a narrative being developed?
Three things. The first one was I'd been in that pub when the fans arrived back, and they didn't know each other. They all told the same story. Mm-hmm. They all told exactly the same story of what had happened. So right that night, I was hearing firsthand from people who'd gone into the Leppings Lane terrace, they'd gone down the tunnel, they'd been stuck outside previously, and then went in through the gate and down the tunnel into the packs of pens. And they were, of crowded pens, they were telling the same story. So that was the first indication that I knew from, for want of a better phrase, I knew from the horse's mouth. Mm-hmm. And people in those shocked circumstances don't lie because they're shocked. They're telling you just, you know, how awful it was, how dreadful it was. The second thing was that I'd worked a lot on deaths in contested circumstances, and I'd seen how authorities actually use the system, use the process in order to escape liability. Mm-hmm. So I was skeptical when I saw how the first of all, how the Home Office inquiry was set up, although to give Justice Taylor his due, his first interim report did say that the main reason for the disaster, the main cause was overcrowding, but the main reason was lack of police control of the crowd. But in his second report, a few months later, his final report, he never mentioned Hillsborough again. And subsequently, I'd love to have interviewed him on this. Subsequently, he apparently backed off from his first. He thought he'd gone over the top originally. But none of that made any difference because the police inquiry decided that there was no one responsible. There was no evidence to suggest there had been institutional failure. And then, apart from that, the inquest verdict, which was at that time they were the longest inquest in legal history, mm-hmm. and they came up with the verdict of accidental death on a majority verdict, 9-2, which absolutely shattered the families after going there month after month to hear the evidence. Yeah. So, that all came true. All of that came true in my head, that the process wouldn't work because those in authority, as my previous work had shown, whether it had been deaths in custody, deaths of Jimmy Kelly in Liverpool, Little Towers in Newcastle, the authorities are always one step ahead. They always have the best lawyers. They always have the input that they can engineer. Mm-hmm. And so that was my second skepticism. The third one was the media. The media, in the immediate aftermath of Hillsborough, the day after Hillsborough, the media was caught and was quite positive. Within days, this changed. And it was led by 7 newspapers. The worst offender was The Sun, mm-hmm. Which published the headline, The Truth, and said that Liverpool fans had sexually assaulted a young woman who happened to be one of Trevor Hicks's 2 daughters who died. And, of course, there was no proof of that, and it never happened. That they'd urinated on the dead. They'd never done that, as if, you could imagine that. That they'd stolen from the dead. That as people were lying on the pitch, they'd stolen money from them. Mm-hmm. There were cameras everywhere. There was no evidence of that. And incidentally, Kelvin Mackenzie, who was the editor, he had wanted to run the headline, "You Scum." And his political editor talked him out of it, and so they ran The Truth. And that became apocryphal. That became the dominant discourse. But I also looked at 5 other newspapers, 7 in all, but 5 in particular, that ran exactly the same story, mm-hmm. but they didn't headline it in the same way. And they all went back to key sources. What, of course, I subsequently discovered when I got access with the independent panel many years later, what I subsequently discovered was this had all come from briefings. They'd been briefed by a senior police officer. Yeah. They'd been briefed by the head of the Police Federation for South Yorkshire. And they'd been briefed by Irving Patnick, who was a Conservative MP for Sheffield Hallam. All 3 had briefed them through a very small news service, which is based in Sheffield, run by 3 brothers. And those briefings went out online to the newspapers, and those allegations were rooted in those briefings. They were rooted in those faxes, as they were in those days, that were sent out. How can I be so confident that this happened? When I was on the Hillsborough Independent panel and we got access to 2 million documents, at the 11th hour, one of the documents I got were those faxes.
Right.
I have those faxes here in the house in my possession, and I can name the people who sent them. I can give you the exact time of day that they were sent, and they all arrived simultaneously at those newspapers. Because whatever Kelvin Mackenzie is, he's not stupid. He thought that he could stand over that story and that headline and those appalling comments because he had those faxes. And I knew this all along. The other thing I want to say about that is on the very day that those headlines came out, the Police Federation were meeting in a cafe, a restaurant called Pickwick's in Sheffield. And in that restaurant, at that meeting, they were discussing how they were going to promote their story through the Police Federation. And in through the door walks the chief constable. Now, this never happens. You never have a chief constable attending a union meeting of ordinary police officers. And he then says that he can't make the statement about Liverpool fans causing the disaster, but they can.
Yeah.
And he basically gives them the words that they could use, and he leaves. How do I know that? Because when I was on the Hillsborough Independent panel, I got the minutes of that meeting. It's there in black and white. It's here in my house. That was the third element in the aftermath. Of course, I didn't know all that at the time, but I suspected it. I suspected somebody got to these editors in that period of 4 days after the disaster. So those were the three elements, if you like, of me realizing that a whole different narrative was being orchestrated, and that's why we set up the Hillsborough Independent Research Project, or the Hillsborough Project as it was called.
Some of the things you mentioned there, it's corruption to the worst degree, Phil. I mean, the headlines that were run by the Sun newspaper, I think it was that the Liverpool fans picked the pockets of the dead. I mean, that kind of line has never left the consciousness of not only Liverpool, people of Liverpool, but anyone with a working class background, anyone who opposes this type of corruption for the betterment of the authoritative figure. Now, when I'm looking at how this is escalating in the background, would I be right to say that the lie started with David Duckenfield? That's where the lie began, when he stated that the Liverpool fans had forced open that exit gate. Yeah,
it's a really interesting question, that, because he's caught in the headlights. You know, here's a man who's never, ever had responsibility for policing a major football match in a major stadium. And he's on duty. And he's only been at Hillsborough to observe 2 previous football matches, both ordinary matches, with one of them a midweek game with very small attendances. He took over because there was an allegation of corruption in the force, and Bernard Moe, who had been his predecessor, had been moved sideways. And Moe said he would come back just to police the semi-final. And the Chief Constable, Peter Wright, who incidentally was from Liverpool, he turned him down. So Duckenfield was in charge. On the day, he turns up, he briefs his men and women at about 11 to 12 in the morning, and then he disappears. He disappears. And to this day, and all of the documents I have on Hillsborough, I've never been able to trace it. The court case against him, the inquest, none of it were able to reveal precisely where he was for the 2 hours between 12 noon and 2 o'clock. So he disappears. He leaves the Bernard Murray, his assistant, who's very experienced, he leaves him in charge of the control box and goes. When he comes back, it's 2 o'clock, and it all happens. And it all happens so fast. He's asked to open the gate. He doesn't even understand the fact that there are central gates. He hasn't got that in his consciousness. He doesn't know the ground. And because he's asked by the senior officer outside the ground desperately to open the exit gates, he opens the exit gates without securing the tunnel. So the tunnel is a 1 in 6 illegal gradient down into the backs of the 2 pens, which are already full. When people come through the gates, all they see is the word standing above the tunnel until they go straight down it into the backs of those pens. He's up in the control box, and it's absolutely self-evident. I've stood in that control box myself. It's self-evident from the distance I could kick a ball. It's self-evident that those 2 pens are completely packed tight, whereas the side pens, people are sitting in the sun reading the newspaper. They're sitting down in a sunny day on the steps reading a newspaper. And yet the central pens are already full. And down that tunnel, that 1 in 6 gradient tunnel, 2,000 fans walk into the back of the 2 pens already full. When they turn, they can't go sideways, they can't go forwards. So when they turn to try and go back, there are more coming down the tunnel. He is completely, by this point, out of his depth. And what he does is he lies. He lies. There's no question. It's there in black and white. He says to the head of the FA and his assistant, he says to them, the Liverpool fans have forced the gate and they've come down the tunnel into the back of France. They've rushed the tunnel. Graham Kelly, who is the recipient of this news and who heads the FA, he then feeds this information immediately. Within 2 hours, Jacques Georges, who's president of FIFA, is talking about Liverpool fans as animals charging into the stadium. So it's now gone round the world. Later that evening, when the truth becomes clear to the chief constable instructs the media that Duckenfield made a mistake. But the lie then is told. The lie consolidates. The atmosphere that is created of that lie, that somehow Liverpool fans forced it. And the reason that is then held up is because if you look at Hillsborough, 24,000 fans had to go through a group of turnstiles at one end of the pitch. Can you imagine going into any stadium where the only entry to the end terrace, the stand above it, and half of the stand down the side of the pitch is down one end? So 23,000 fans had to go into that small area, no bigger than a school playground, with a stone wall on one side and a fence above a river on the other. It was a bottleneck that had been warned about from 1986. It was well known. And so the issue of who was responsible was immediately deflected, even though by the time it came to the following day, the Sunday, Duckenfield was shown to have lied in panic or whatever the phrase was used at the time. Mm-hmm. The actual story stuck, that Liverpool fans had created the disaster by storming into the stadium. And it never went away. And it was built on over the years, over and again.
It was, and one of the things that really struck me when I was reading your book, Phil, was the fact that the alcohol testing was made as a priority pretty early in the process, wasn't it, to ensure that, or to check whether or not their idea of the fans was correct. They were testing people who were lying deceased for alcohol consumption. It was one of the greatest outrages of Hillsborough, and there were many, was that the chief pathologist met with the head pathologist from the University of Sheffield, met with the coroner in a lay-by on the way to the ground at about 6 o'clock in the evening, maybe a bit earlier. So the disaster was still unfolding, really, in terms of people in hospital and all the rest of it. And the decision was then taken
by the coroner, but in consultation with the pathologist, the decision was taken to take blood alcohol levels from all who died. Now, that decision was informed by the South Yorkshire Police. So the South Yorkshire Police had informed the coroner, who then, in consultation with the pathologist, decided to take blood alcohol levels of everyone who died, including a 10-year-old boy. Everyone. And that's what stuck all along. That creates this idea that Liverpool fans, without tickets, and there's no proof of that in actual fact, we've been able to demonstrate the opposite to that, that in terms of, we can now these days use technology to head count numbers on terraces, and we've done that. And what we discovered is that there were it was more than 200 under capacity on the terrace. So the idea that there were all these Liverpool fans that came in without tickets is a nonsense. There is no evidence at all that shows that Liverpool fans tried to get in without tickets or storm the stadium without tickets. That was the first thing. The second thing is that they arrived late. They didn't arrive late. What happened was there were roadworks into Sheffield on the Pennines. A lot of the coaches pulled in, and then the fans were, as always, escorted to the ground. Mm-hmm. They didn't actually arrive in those escorts until about 2:30. So they weren't arriving minutes before the kickoff, but the build-up started at 2:30. So that's when the pressure really began. So this idea that everyone was in pubs and came out of pubs and then went off to the ground just 5 minutes before the game, absolutely no proof. And we can show it. We have all the film. I've been through it all for the panel. I've been through it all. So that was the second thing. But on top of this was this idea that Liverpool fans were not only drunk, not only arriving late, but also were violent in some way, were unbiddable, wouldn't do as they were told, etc. That there's just no justification for any of that. So by the time we get down to looking at the real issues, what we uncover very clearly is an orchestrated alternative story. Mm-hmm. They arrived late, they arrived without tickets, and that they were violent. None of those issues were true.
Obviously, a lot of this has been covered in the book and in the aftermath, but when you put it specifically to an audience like, the Celtic State of Mind audience, I think you'll get a lot of this information being heard for the first time, Phil. And I think that's important as well. Because and I think going into the detail, I am one for detail, because I think that otherwise people just think you're just someone else who's just coming out with an opinion, when in actual fact, that's why I keep saying, I have the documents, I was looking at an interview you did. You were speaking about the two reports that you produced for the Hillsborough project, and you stated that once they were produced, the impact was fairly diminished. I mean, what kind of response did you get once you made the reports, when you compiled them?
When the reports came out, I really thought that we were going to have a major impact, because it was coming after the Taylor report, especially the second report. I mean, it's nearly 400 pages long, and it's a book, and it exposes so much of what had happened, what had really happened, and also it exposes the ineffectiveness of the official inquiries. I've always been concerned about using the phrase cover-up, because it's the way in which authorities work. Authorities work to actually deflect blame and to come away with minimal responsibility. Mm-hmm. And that's the way they play the game. And in actual fact, you can see that, because one of the parts of the case were the civil actions. And the civil actions were decided behind closed doors. And it's my understanding that the police accepted 80% of the payments, and the other authorities the remaining 20%. But they did this with a principle of war, a principle in law of accepting a payment without liability. So in other words, there's no criminal liability attached, but that is a sign in itself of how our systems operate. And of course, families are being paid minimal damages, for the loss of their loved ones. Absolutely minimal damages. They were encouraged by their solicitors at the time to settle, and that's what they did. And that's kind of then puts a lid on it. And that's the way these situations always work. Mm-hmm. And it's my responsibility as someone who works in and around the law to demonstrate how that process happens and how ordinary people become marginalised by that process.
Ordinary people as well, Phil, the big thing is just not even a misunderstanding of the process, but just having no knowledge of it, whereas you're coming up against these colossal organisations who know exactly how the process works. So,
let me just put that in, that one comment you make, which is really important, into some context. At the first inquest, every single person in authority that might have had any liability in every organisation had top-line solicitors and top-line barristers. Mm-hmm. At that stage, there was no legal aid for families at inquests. And 43 families clubbed together and were represented by one barrister. That gives you a perfect illustration of how the system is weighted against ordinary people. In the law, we teach our students about the phrase equality of arms. What that means is that whenever we come into a court, whatever form of court it is, we all should be on an equal footing. When people were being examined or cross-examined, as it's called in a criminal court, when they were being examined in the inquest, you had a team of barristers working for the different authorities collectively and one barrister for the families. So the opportunity to actually extricate the truth from witnesses to a jury in those circumstances is really problematic. By the time we come to the second inquest, of course, they were legally aided, and they had a whole barrage of top lawyers, the families did, but not in those early days. And I think it's that really made it clear to the families that they were up against it at every level, and to the fans who were excluded. The survivors were excluded from everything. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, so it's worth saying something about that we talk about the 96 who died at Hillsborough. First of all, there are many others who died as a consequence of Hillsborough, directly from illnesses or even by their own hand. A lot of people died prematurely because of the suffering of Hillsborough, losing their loved ones. So when we look at how many died, it's far higher than, as a consequence of Hillsborough, it's far higher than 96. Mm-hmm. And the other point that's worth making is that those survivors who were in that crush, who saw people dying around them, the smell of death, the heat of death, they've had to live with that. And they've had to live with being vilified and being told that they caused the disaster all these years. So it's really important to think about Hillsborough, not only in terms of those who actually died as a direct consequence, but also those who've died as a longer-term consequence, and the suffering of survivors down all the years.
Oh, absolutely, Phil. I think the one that struck a chord with myself was Stephen Whittle, who had sold his ticket, and he committed suicide 22 years later. I remember reading about that sad case, and there are many other cases like that as well. So
that's right.
That when you look at the fact that you called it right quite clearly, you've then written 2 reports and you don't feel that they've had sufficient impact, then embarking on your book. But you mentioned, interestingly earlier, the documentary that was made by Jimmy McGovern back in 96. So that was a few years before your book. What do you think came out of that? Was there new evidence? Was there an impact that added impetus to your idea to produce your own book? Jimmy's
film, and the person who worked on it as the researcher is Katie Jones, who eventually worked on the Hillsborough Independent panel with me. Mm-hmm. Jimmy's film basically developed out of our two initial reports. There was some new added information that Katie had actually managed to get hold of, some documents that she'd managed to get hold of. But the film was based around what we knew in those original reports. At that time, we didn't know that the police had ordered the review and alteration of statements.
Yes.
And we didn't know that at the time. I subsequently discovered that. In fact, just as Jimmy's film was coming out, I was researching that and got access to all of the police statements. And I can't go into the full detail of that because of an imminent court case. Yeah. But what I can say was that added a whole dimension, that statements had been through a process of review and alteration internally, and not just the police statements, but it turned out the ambulance service statements as well. So when Hillsborough, the Truth came out, apart from all that had gone into our first report and into Jimmy's film, there was the whole process of disclosure of how the aftermath had been handled. So it wasn't just about the cause of the disaster, the events on the day of the disaster, but now it was how the whole aftermath had been handled and how it had been engineered. And that, to me, was, I called it a tragedy out of a disaster. That, you have the disaster and then you have the tragedy of this lack of appropriate investigation. So, and also the changes that came to statements and the narrative then being reinforced. When I discovered that, I couldn't believe, I couldn't believe my eyes when I discovered it. Getting hold of a whole range of different documents has demonstrated many times, that stuff happened that was completely inappropriate.
You discovered that some of the statements were in triplicate form, and you realised that they had been amended and they'd been reviewed. That particular moment after, how long are we talking there? Probably seven or 8 years at that point. Quite incredible for yourself to discover that.
Yes, it was. It was, and I was in the Home Office reading room down in at the UK government, and I was actually in the House of Lords reading room, not the Home Office reading room, and I went through them all, and I could see there in my very eyes the instructions that were being made, left on post-its on the corner of these statements of what should be changed and what shouldn't be changed, and lines through statements, and it was amazing. And I came back. I was living in Liverpool at the time, and I came back up on the train with copies of these statements that had been made for me in the reading room, and I brought them back, and I just had that moment where I sat up with my partner until 3 a.m. talking about this and how it happened and what should we do now? How could I do this? How are we going to make this public? And I went to bed, and about an hour later, I sat bolt upright in bed, and the only time I've ever done it in my life, and shouted, "They all knew." And she said, what are you talking about? I said, they all must have known. For that to have happened, this wasn't just the police investigation, it was the Home Office, it was Lord Justice Taylor, it was all of those people who had been involved in the aftermath of Hillsborough and its investigation must have known that process had happened, because the statements were there in different forms. And of course, subsequently, I've been able to demonstrate that they did all know. And in 2009, the 20th anniversary, I'd written a document with the families, for the families, to suggest that we reopen the material, that we give the material over to an independent panel. Yeah. And of course, it's well known that at that time, Andy Burnham, who was Culture Secretary, stands in front of the COP and makes this commitment to getting all the documents out. Mm-hmm. I met him that evening in Liverpool, and I said, Andy, you can't do it because there's a 30-year rule on documents, and we're only 20 years down the track. And, of course, what he did was he went back to Gordon Brown, and they changed the law. And so the documents were then able to be released. with the families, put together a proposal for an independent panel, completely independent of government, completely independent of any others. And I named the solicitor I wanted. I wanted Katie Jones on it because obviously she was somebody who had worked on Hillsborough.
Yeah.
And so in 2010, the first independent panel chaired by the Bishop of Liverpool was established, and the research was based with my research team at Queen's University in Belfast. We got access to all of the documents that were available, certainly made available, and any that we didn't have, we tried to hunt down. Literally hours and hours of video and film footage, and we went through it all over the next 2 years. And so the Hillsborough Independent Panel report came out. 2 years later, we launched it at Liverpool City Cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral, only in front of the families. None of this was recorded. What you can see online is a press conference afterwards, but I stood in front of the families in the crypt of the cathedral with all the panel to my side, and I delivered a slide show of our findings, 153 findings, and the exoneration of the fans. And it was just a remarkable moment. That moment, I stood outside of the cathedral looking across the Mersey, and I knew what we were going to say, and I knew what I was going to tell them. But nothing prepared me for the 5-minute standing ovation that came from all the families and survivors to the panel. I was just like, right, where do we go from here? Yeah. And within minutes, beamed from the House of Commons live was David Cameron, the new Prime Minister, giving a double apology. First of all, he apologised for the disaster itself and said it should never have happened. And secondly, he apologised for the fact that it hadn't been appropriately investigated. It was the second apology he'd made, because he'd had to make an apology to the Bloody Sunday family, similarly over the deaths in Derry. And it was quite overwhelming. I stood at the back of the cathedral watching this on a big screen, having just done the presentation, and cried my eyes out.
It's no wonder. I mean, Phil, after so many years, to finally have what at that point was an incredible turnaround, and the actual exoneration of the victims, it was massive. But again, we're going into the realms of another process after that, weren't we?
Yeah, I mean, immediately, one of the things that they set up was an independent police complaints commission, as it was called then. It's now called the Independent Office for Police Complaints. But it was set up, and the commission set up a full investigation into the whole process. There was a criminal investigation by the police, which both of those are still ongoing, and at their height they had 200 full-time officers working on each, the biggest ever single investigation in legal history. And then, of course, the Lord Chief Justice quashed the inquest verdicts, and we had the new inquests, which the preliminary hearings were throughout 2013 into 2014. And then we had the 2 years inquest, now becoming the longest inquest in legal history. And the inquest was split into 7 parts. I was on secondment to the legal teams from my job. I was on secondment half-time and then full-time towards the end. And, of course, the verdict that came in was remarkable, that all who died had been unlawfully killed. Yeah. So it was an unlawful killing verdict. And most importantly, two most important issues, 25 criticisms of the police and the other authorities. The majority were the police, but also the ground, the local authority, all those involved in the architects, the surveyors, all of those involved were all heavily criticised in that verdict. And then the moment of real importance was when the coroner looked at the chair of the jury and said to her, were the fans in any way to blame for what happened at Hillsborough? And she just said no. This was like, I was in with the families and the lawyers in the main court, which was an adapted building on an industrial estate near Warrington. And I just had my head between my knees crying. And families on both sides of me comforting me. I mean, that is ridiculous, that you get into a situation where you're so overwhelmed yourself that it's bereaved families who are comforting you. And I always thought this should be the other way around. But that was a very emotional moment and a very important moment. And it was the realization that whatever else would happen in the future, this would stand forever. First of all, the Hillsborough Independent Panel report with its 153 findings against the authorities, and then an unlawfully killed verdict in the court on all who died, plus the condemnation of the authorities and the exoneration of the fans. And it all came together in that moment. And that was the most important moment to me. Yes, people want to see people prosecuted and so on and so forth, but many have died since. Yeah. And the prosecution of individuals for their part is fair enough, but we knew that that wasn't going to happen, that the majority of those people who'd been directly involved, particularly in the police, would not be prosecuted, and they weren't. But the issue was that the collective decision of a jury after the longest inquest in legal history was that the fans had been unlawfully killed, and that they laid the responsibility at the doors of all of those who had any involvement with the deaths at Hillsborough. The only organisation that wasn't named was the Football Association, who'd staged the event. But all of the others were.
That exoneration, Phil, after so many years of fighting for justice, and it goes against everything that the Liverpool fans were accused of all those years ago. The dreadful, dreadful media coverage of it. And for years and years, people making these spiteful comments. I think with regards to social justice, and that's something that this is actually all about, at some point during that process, it must have been a blow when, for example, the book didn't get the impact or have the impact that you would have expected. But you're very much a believer that you take on, and it's not a project, you take on a situation and you will see it through to the very, very end. And 31 years later, you still are involved in that. And it's an incredible testament to you. But, I mean, during that process, there must have been many moments where you thought you're never, ever going to get any kind of resolution or conclusion.
Yeah, I did think that. When I came to Belfast and I started doing my other work on prisons and my work here on injustice here in the north, I kept working on Hillsborough. I never missed a memorial. I went to every single memorial with my family. I stayed working with the families. I wrote articles. I did my best. Mm-hmm. But I knew I was up against it. I knew that it would only be if we could get access to the documents that things would change. And indeed, that's what did happen. So I never lost faith that if we got access to the documents, that the truth would be there in those documents. And of course it was. I think that, in retrospect, looking back, I kind of feel that when you take on a project like this, and I tell my students this, that if you're taking on research, you can't just say, well, I was only doing the research for that time. Mm-hmm. You have to see it through as far as you can see it through, right to the end if possible. And, my emotions here, to some extent, are not relevant, but I always think of these issues in terms of individuals. And one moment really struck me out of the massive moments. The day after the Hillsborough verdict came out, I was walking through Liverpool on my own, and it was quite. The street I was on was right in the centre, but it didn't have a lot of people on it. And I saw a guy coming towards me, and he broke into a run, and he was running straight at me. I knew it was friendly, and he ran straight at me, and he ran into me, grabbing me, lifting me off my feet, and spinning me round. And he put me down, and he said, "Phil, I don't know you, but I have walked through this city all these years with my head down. Today is the first day I feel I can walk with my head up. I knew I wasn't responsible for Hillsborough. I was in Leppings Lane. I knew I'd done nothing wrong, but the world condemned me." That was the moment for me, because it was really in the heart and the mind of an individual who'd suffered all that time. So what I went through over those 31 years, up to now, what I'd gone through at that point was nothing by comparison to what he'd been through. I still have my family. I still have my children. Mm-hmm. I still have my good friends around me. I didn't lose anybody at Hillsborough. My life was changed by Hillsborough, but it wasn't changed in the way it's been changed for the bereaved and for the survivors. And so I look at him and I think if he could walk through his city now with his head held high, that he had on authority somehow, he'd been exonerated, that'll do me.
To carry that condemnation for all those years and decades, Phil. So,
yeah,
I mean, just sharing that with us it's incredibly powerful. So thanks very much for sharing that experience with us, Phil. I mean, where are we now? We know what obviously had transpired in November of last year after a trial at Preston Crown Court in relation to David Duckenfield being found not guilty of the gross negligence manslaughter of 95 Liverpool fans, not forgetting the 96th fan who obviously was in a coma for a lengthy period of time. Yeah. So Tony Bland died, I think, was it in 93?
Yeah, 3.5 years later.
Yeah. Where are we now? And again, for anybody listening in, is there still anything that can be done in relation to getting behind the campaign, be that monetary donations or any kind of support that anyone can offer?
I think that the families will speak for themselves, the Hillsborough Family Support Group, and I would recommend people go onto their website. But to a large extent, it's now over. There's one more trial to be had relating to the review and alteration of statements in the aftermath. The David Duckenfield trial, as you say, is over. There won't be any more prosecutions. And I think that we're at a position where we have the outcome that is appropriate. Mm-hmm. Whether or not David Duckenfield should or should not have been found guilty, he wasn't. But that's not the point to me. The point from my own personal, I'm not speaking on behalf of families or survivors here, I'm speaking on my own behalf. The point from my own position, what is important was we had a thorough investigation of all the documents. Mm-hmm. The Hillsborough Independent Panel's report now details our findings, and when the final trial is over, that will be back online. Right. The verdict of the inquest will stand forever. I don't think that there is anything further now that the law will give us. The law is exhausted. It's called the exhaustion of domestic outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so that's over. And I think what's really important is that what will stand for all time is that 96 fans went to Hillsborough on a beautiful spring day to watch a football match and didn't come home. And that the responsibility for their deaths was not in the actions of themselves or any of the people they went with or any of the fans, but it was an unsafe stadium. Mm-hmm. It hadn't got an appropriate certificate of that met with local authority guidelines. It was poorly policed, and all of that was revealed in the inquest verdict of unlawful killing and all the riders. Mm-hmm. At the same time as that, we have a report which demonstrates chapter and verse all that had happened in the long build-up to Hillsborough, many years before, and all that happened afterwards. And alongside that, we have the exoneration of the fans. That is the outcome, and that is the outcome that will stand forever.
Not just those directly affected, but all Liverpool fans. Obviously, the anthem of the fans, "You'll Never Walk Alone," that emotional tribute to the club, and they never did with you on their side, Phil. I would ask any Celtic fans out there who are listening to this podcast to read your book. And when I was reading it, as I say, it really struck a chord with me. It's so powerful, and your work that you've done on this case over a period of over 30 years now is quite astonishing, Phil. It's unbelievable, the work that you've done.
That's very kind, Paul.
Huge amount of respect for what you have done for the people in the city of Liverpool. So, listen, thank you so much for your time today, and it's been a real privilege to speak to you. And hopefully, one of these days, I can see you myself and shake your hand, because what you've done is just incredible.
Thank you, Paul. It's been. I'm really pleased that you asked me to do this. I'm pleased that there is still that core interest in what happened, because I feel that it's important for the families and also for the survivors to know that the story is still being told. And you're right, they didn't walk alone, and they didn't walk alone because a lot of other people believed in them. And my part in all of this has been to do my job to the best of my ability. And I think that when I was offered the Queen's Empire Medal for my work on Hillsborough, it was with great pleasure that I turned it down, because the government never stood by Hillsborough in the early days. I didn't do this work in order to be honoured by a medal that is in the name of the British Empire, which I don't believe in. Mm-hmm. And I suppose the one accolade that I did take was the freedom of my home city, freedom of the city of Liverpool, and that had been campaigned for by the families, and that was a great accolade. But the reality is that they are the real heroes in all of this, the bereaved and the survivors. They are the people who, just like you and me, live ordinary lives and had their lives completely torn apart, not only by the deaths of their loved ones, but also by a system that was against them. And if I could play a part in turning that round, then I feel that it's a privilege to have done that. But thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Absolute pleasure on this part, Phil. So please take care of yourself, and hopefully we will speak
Paul.
Again in the future.
Thanks, Paul. All the best.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.